Something is happening in Mexico that you cannot ignore. It is not a rumor, it is not a conspiracy. It is something a holy man predicted more than 60 years ago, and that today is happening exactly as he described it. His name was Francesco Forgon. The world knew him as Padre Pio, an Italian priest who bore the stigmata on his body for 50 years, a man who saw souls, who read consciences, who described future events with a precision that even his fiercest critics could not explain. And among all his prophecies, there is one that for decades no one fully understood, one that speaks of signs in the sky, of a collective awakening, of a Latin American nation that would become the epicenter of something spiritually unprecedented. Many dismissed it until now because in recent months something has changed in Mexico, something the conventional media are not covering in the way they should, something millions of people are experiencing in silence without knowing that it is part of a much larger pattern. Could it be a coincidence? Perhaps, but when you begin connecting the dates, the events, the documented apparitions, and the geopolitical movements shaking Latin America in this year 2026, coincidence ceases to be a valid option. Padre Pio said something that will make your blood run cold when you hear it in context. He said there would come a moment in history when heaven and earth would begin speaking the same language, and that moment would not be gentle, it would not be peaceful. It would be terrifying for those who were unprepared and luminous for those who were prepared. The question you need to ask yourself today is not whether this is happening. The question is, which side of that line are you on? In this video, I am going to reveal everything to you. Padre Pio's exact words, the events in Mexico that correspond to those words, and what this means for you, for your life, and for the path ahead of you. Stay until the end because what comes in the final part of this video is the most important thing of all. It is information that will change the way you see what is happening in the world. If this content interests you, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Many more people need to hear what you are about to discover. The year is 1947. In a small monastery in San Giovanni Rotondo, in southern Italy, a priest with bandaged hands receives a young Polish military officer. The young man's eyes are burdened with guilt. He has survived things he would rather forget. He has come to confess. Before the young man says a single word, the priest looks at him and says, "I know what you carry, and I also know what you are going to do when you return to your country." The young man does not understand. The priest tells him that one day he will become the most important voice of the church in the world, that he will dress in white, that he will change history. That young man was Karol Wojtyła. Decades later, the world knew him as Pope John Paul II. This story is not an urban legend. It is documented. John Paul II himself recounted it on multiple occasions, and it was he who canonized Padre Pio as a saint of the Catholic Church in 2002. But what few people know is that this was not the only time Padre Pio spoke about the future with such disturbing clarity. Padre Pio was born in 1887 in a small farming village in Italy. From childhood, he had experiences that his parents did not know how to explain. Visions during sleep, conversations with figures no one else could see, a constant feeling that the veil between this world and the next was much thinner for him than it was for everyone else. At the age of 15, he entered the Franciscan order. At 22, he was ordained a priest, and on September 20th, 1918, something happened that marked the rest of his life. He was praying alone in the chapel when he fell to the floor. The brothers who came to help him found something that left them paralyzed. He had open wounds on his hands, his feet, and his side, the same wounds that, according to the Gospels, Jesus had on the cross. This is called the stigmata, and Padre Pio carried them on his body for 50 years. The most renowned doctors in Italy and the Vatican examined him. No one could find a physical cause. The wounds did not become infected, did not heal, and according to those who were close to him, they gave off a fragrance described as roses or incense. Why does all of this matter? Because what made Padre Pio a spiritual phenomenon was not only his wounds. It was what he said. It was what he knew without anyone telling him. There are testimonies from people who went to see him for the first time without having spoken to anyone at the monastery, and Padre Pio described their sins, their fears, and their personal situations with a precision that made even the most skeptical people cry. But there was something more, something he himself cautiously admitted. He saw the future, not always and not in a controlled way, but at specific moments when he prayed, when he was in a state of deep contemplation. Images, scenes, and voices came to him, and he wrote them down. Some of those writings were preserved by his fellow members of the order. Others, it is said, were archived by the Vatican and never made public. But there are fragments circulating among historians, theologians, and devotees that reveal something that today, in 2026, is impossible to ignore. Among those fragments are references to a land in the south of the American continent, a land marked by a unique mixture of indigenous spirituality and Christian faith, a land where, Padre Pio said, the ancient and the new would meet at the moment of the Great Purification. That description fits Mexico in a way that takes your breath away. Could it be a coincidence? Perhaps, but then you would have to explain the 3 specific signs he described for that place and that time. And that is exactly what comes in the next part. Stay. What remains is the most important part. Padre Pio was not vague when he spoke about the future. That is what distinguished him from other visionaries of his time. He did not use incomprehensible metaphors. He did not speak in codes that were impossible to decipher. When he described something that was going to happen, he described it with concrete details. And when he spoke of the signs that would precede the time of the threshold in that southern land, he was specific. The first sign, a shaking of institutional faith, not a physical earthquake, but a spiritual one, a crisis within the religious structure that would lead millions of people to seek the sacred outside traditional temples, to seek God in silence, in small communities, and through direct experience. Does that sound familiar? In Mexico, membership in the Catholic Church has fallen historically over the last decade, not because people have lost faith, but because they are searching for it in other places, in indigenous spirituality, in meditation, in small prayer communities, and in personal experiences that do not pass through an institutional intermediary. That is exactly what Padre Pio described. The second sign, a power arriving from the north and changing the rules of the south, a political and economic force altering the balance of the region in an unprecedented way, generating both fear and awakening. Right now, in 2026, the relationship between Mexico and the United States is going through one of its most tense moments in modern history. Tariff policies, migration pressure, forced negotiations over security. Mexico is being redefined from the outside while attempting to redefine itself from within. This is not only geopolitics. It is exactly the second sign. And the third sign, the third is the most disturbing and the most hopeful at the same time. Padre Pio spoke of an awakening of the guardians, an activation of ordinary people without titles or positions of power who suddenly feel an inner urgency to act, to help, and to connect, as though something invisible were calling all of them at the same time. In Mexico, this phenomenon is tangible. Today, there is an unprecedented rise in spiritual collectives, community support networks, and young people leaving conventional careers to dedicate themselves to healing, teaching, and building community. They are not doing it because it is fashionable. They are doing it because they feel a calling that they cannot fully explain. All 3 signs are here, but here is the part most people overlook. Padre Pio did not describe these signs as the beginning of a catastrophe. He described them as the beginning of a transition, one that would be uncomfortable, yes, one that would bring visible external chaos, but whose purpose was to awaken something that had been asleep for a long time: collective consciousness. And this is where his vision connects with something that other spiritual traditions have also seen. From the Maya to Sufi mystics, from the Book of Daniel to the prophecies of the indigenous peoples of North America, they all speak of the same period. They all use different words to describe the same reality. We are at a pivotal moment, a moment when the path we take as humanity carries a different weight than it would during any other period of history. Does that sound exaggerated? Consider this: the convergence of the climate crisis, geopolitical conflict, institutional collapse, mass spiritual awakening, and unprecedented technological advancement is happening simultaneously, not sequentially, but all at once. That has no precedent in recorded history. Padre Pio said that when the three signs were fulfilled, the period he called the hour of choice would begin, a time when every person would have to decide, consciously or unconsciously, from where they wanted to live, from fear or from faith. And Mexico, he said, would be one of the epicenters of that choice. Why Mexico? What does that land possess that makes it so special in Padre Pio's vision? We discover that now. It is not a coincidence. Nothing in spiritual vision is a coincidence. And when you understand why Mexico occupies such a specific place in the prophetic traditions of completely different cultures, you will begin to see the larger map. Let us begin with something official history barely mentions. Mexico is one of the few places in the world where two major spiritual civilizations merged instead of completely destroying each other. Mesoamerican spirituality, with its sacred calendars, its understanding of cyclical time, and its deep bond with natural forces, did not disappear when Catholicism arrived. Transformed. It integrated, created something unique. The Virgin of Guadalupe is the most visible example, appearing on the hill of Tepelac, a place sacred to the Aztecs before the conquest, speaking in Nahuatl, with an image filled with Mesoamerican astronomical symbolism on her mantle. This was not a historical accident. For millions of believers, it was a deliberate bridge between two spiritual worlds. Padre Pio, according to records of his visions, spoke of this fusion. He said that in that land where the mother appeared clothed in stars, there is a spiritual memory that the world will need, a memory of how to live in relationship with cycles, with the earth, and with the invisible. That is exactly what humanity is searching for right now. But there is something deeper. The Mayan calendar, which has its roots in Mesoamerican civilizations, does not end in a specific year as many people believed. What it marks is the closing of one cycle and the opening of another. According to the living guardians of that tradition today, the new cycle has specific characteristics: greater permeability between the spiritual and the material, greater urgency in collective awakening, and greater visibility of the contrast between light and shadow. In simple terms, what could previously remain hidden can no longer remain hidden. What was previously invisible is becoming obvious. And Mexico, because it is the land where that tradition reached its greatest expression, functions as a kind of antenna. What happens there happens first with greater intensity and then expands outward. This explains why violence in Mexico is not only violence, why spirituality in Mexico is not only religion, and why the political crisis in Mexico is not only politics. Everything has a deeper layer than the conventional media can or want to show. Padre Pio went further. In one of the fragments most frequently cited by theologians who study his prophetic work, he said something that today is chilling in its precision. There will come a time when the land of the eagle and the serpent will be the most important battlefield in the world. Not with weapons, but with souls. The eagle and the serpent, Mexico's national emblem. A battlefield of souls. What does that mean in practical terms? It means that the decisions made in Mexico, the conversations that take place there, and the spiritual movements born there will have an impact on global collective consciousness that goes far beyond what any conventional geopolitical analysis can measure. And we are watching this happen. Indigenous movements defending water, land, and cultural memory are generating resonance throughout the world. Healing and spiritual communities emerging in Mexican cities are being visited by people from dozens of countries. Social crises in Mexico are forcing conversations about justice and dignity. This is not a geopolitical coincidence. It is what Padre Pio called the activation of the field. And if all of this seems fascinating to you, wait for what comes next, because there is a part of the prophecy that almost no one knows, a part Padre Pio kept to himself for years, which he shared with only one person, and which that person, already elderly, decided to reveal before dying. That is what comes in the next part. That person's name was Maria Winowska. She was a Polish journalist and writer who interviewed Padre Pio several times during the 1940s and 1950s. She wrote one of the most detailed and respected biographies of his life, and shortly before her death, in an interview that few people outside specialized academic circles have read, she revealed something Padre Pio had told her in private. He told her that there was one vision that disturbed him more than any other, one he did not share publicly because, in his own words, the world was not ready to hear it without turning it into terror or fanaticism. But he entrusted it to her. He told her that he had seen a future time when humanity would stand on the edge of a fundamental division, not a war in the conventional sense, but a collective inner division concerning the kind of world human beings wanted to build. And in that vision, there were two clearly distinguishable forces. One he called the force of forgetting. Everything that drives human beings toward disconnection, isolation, purposeless consumption, entertainment as anesthesia, and power as an end in itself. And the other he called the force of remembrance. Everything that drives human beings toward connection, community, the search for meaning, service, and awareness of something greater than oneself. Padre Pio told Winowska that during that time Mexico would be one of the places where this tension would be most visible and most intense, because it possessed the ingredients of both forces in extraordinary quantities, and that the outcome of that tension had not been decided in advance. That is the most important thing, he said. He did not predict an inevitable disaster. He did not prophesy a catastrophe without escape. What he saw was a crossroads, a moment of genuine choice, and he said that the difference between one path and the other would not be made by governments, institutions, or great visible leaders. It would be made by ordinary people who decided to awaken. That resonates differently when you view it in the context of 2026. Think about what is happening in Mexico right now. A presidency that creates deep divisions, an economy under unprecedented external pressure, violence that seems to defy every conventional solution, and at the same time a spiritual, community, and cultural flourishing that conventional media rarely cover because it does not fit the narrative of chaos. Both forces are active at the same time in the same territory, exactly as Padre Pio described. But there is one detail Winowska mentioned at the end of that interview that changes everything. She asked Padre Pio, "And what should ordinary people do during that time?" And he answered with something she remembered word for word until the end of her life. He said, "Remember who you are, not who the world told you that you are, but who you truly are. That alone, that is enough to change what is coming." For decades later, those words sound like the most urgent and most ignored message of our time. Because we live in an age that does everything possible to make you forget who you are. The algorithm shows you what keeps you reactive, not what awakens you. The economic system rewards you for producing and consuming, not for reflecting and connecting. The culture of mass entertainment offers you a permanent escape from the only question that truly matters. Why are you here? Padre Pio did not say that we need extraordinary heroes. He said that we need ordinary people who remember their purpose. And that connects directly with what is happening in Mexico at a level that most people have not yet seen, because something is happening right now in 2026 that fits the final part of the vision. The most hopeful and also the most demanding part comes now. There is a story that took place in Oaxaca in 2024 that received almost no media coverage. A Zapotec indigenous community that had spent decades fighting against the dispossession of its land and institutional abandonment made a decision that left the sociologists, anthropologists, and activists who later studied it perplexed. Instead of radicalizing its resistance toward direct conflict, the community decided to do something different. It called a 40-day assembly, 40 days of prayer, dialogue, ceremonial fasting, and collective decision-making based on the principles of its ancestral tradition. At the end of that assembly, a plan emerged combining legal strategy, community economic organization, and a spiritual support network that extended to neighboring communities. Within 2 years, they recovered access to their land, built a community water system, and created a school where children learn both mathematics and indigenous cosmology. What does this have to do with Padre Pio? He spoke of this, exactly this. He said that the awakening in that land of the eagle and the serpent would not come through great visible movements. It would come through the small, the local, through communities remembering their ancient knowledge and using it to solve modern problems. He called it the path of the mustard seed, small at first, almost invisible, but possessing a force of growth that cannot be stopped. And this phenomenon is not happening only in Oaxaca. It is happening in Chiapas, where Tzila's communities are building community healthcare systems combining traditional medicine with modern knowledge. It is happening in Mexico City, where networks of neighbors are creating local exchange economies that reduce their dependence on the conventional system. It is happening in the Huasteca Potosina, in the Tarahumara mountain range, and along the coasts of Guerrero. Small, local, almost invisible, and at the same time connected by something that goes beyond technology or political organization, a shared intuition that the path forward involves recovering what was nearly lost. This has a name in Mayan tradition: Calliope. Calliope is the inner lightning, the spark of consciousness that ignites when a human being comes into genuine contact with their purpose. It is the moment when you stop living through inertia and begin living by choice. The guardians of the Mayan tradition say that Calliope is not individual. When it is activated in enough people at the same time, it generates a field of consciousness that affects everyone nearby like a resonance. Padre Pio, without having studied Mayan tradition, described something identical in his own language. When enough souls awaken at the same time in one place, that place becomes a spring, and from springs the world drinks. Mexico, at this moment, is functioning as a spring, with all its chaos, with all its violence, with all its crisis, and also with all its spiritual, community, and cultural flourishing. Both things are real. Both things are simultaneous. And that tension, that extreme duality, is exactly the condition that mystics from every tradition have identified as the most fertile ground for awakening. It does not happen in comfort. It happens under pressure. Coal becomes a diamond under pressure, and souls awaken when the world around them no longer allows them to remain asleep. Mexico is being pressured from every direction. From the outside by geopolitical dynamics with the United States, and from the inside by violence, inequality, and institutional crisis. And within that pressure, something is emerging that does not yet have a name in conventional language, but Padre Pio did have a name for it. He called it the resurrection of peoples, and he said that when it began, there would be a sign that would be impossible to ignore for those who had eyes to see. That sign has already occurred, and it comes in the next part. On September 19, 2017, a magnitude 7.1 earthquake shook central Mexico. More than 300 people died. Thousands were left homeless. The damage was enormous, but what happened afterward is what no one has analyzed from the perspective that Padre Pio would have immediately recognized. During the first hours after the earthquake, before any institutional government aid arrived, something massive and immediate happened. Tens of thousands of people went out into the streets without prior organization, without centralized leadership, and without instructions from anyone. They simply went. Young people from wealthy neighborhoods dug through rubble alongside construction workers from working-class areas. University students coordinated with market women to organize supply chains. Gang members from troubled neighborhoods voluntarily guarded collection points so that no one would steal. Media outlets around the world covered it with astonishment. Sociologists wrote about it for years. How was it possible for a city of 20 million people to respond with such spontaneous solidarity? The answer academics did not dare to give, but that millions of Mexicans felt within themselves, was simple, because that is who they truly are. When the system fails, when institutions do not arrive, When fear could paralyze anyone, what lay beneath everything appeared. An extraordinary capacity for community, care, and collective action. Padre Pio spoke of a specific sign for the land of the eagle and the serpent. He said there would be a moment of great shaking, literal or metaphorical, after which the collective soul of that people would be exposed for everyone to see, and what was revealed would show whether that people was ready for the mission that belonged to it. What was seen in September 2017 was a collective response of love, solidarity, and action that traveled around the world. That was the sign. And since that moment, although not in a linear way and not without setbacks, Mexico has not returned to being exactly the same. A consciousness was activated that day in millions of people, an awareness that when external structures fail, there is something internal that can sustain us, something that does not depend on the government, the market, or any institution. It depends on each person choosing to respond from the best version of themselves. Padre Pio called that active grace. Grace not as something you passively receive, but as something activated when you act from your deepest purpose. Now, there is something crucial that Padre Pio emphasized about this period. He said that the signs and the awakening guarantee nothing. They are a door, and a door is useful only if someone decides to walk through it. In terms of Mexico in 2026, this means that the convergence of everything we are describing, the geopolitical crisis, the spiritual and community awakening, and the tension between the forces of forgetting and remembrance, does not have a predetermined outcome. It is being built now by ordinary people who choose to awaken or remain asleep, who choose to act from fear or from faith, who choose to see only the chaos or also the process of transformation within the chaos. And here is the part that connects all of this directly to you. It does not matter in which country you are watching this video. The duality Padre Pio described for Mexico is the same duality that exists in every country, every city, and every community. Mexico is the epicenter, the field where the tension is most visible, but the battlefield he spoke of, the battlefield of souls, has no geographical borders. It is in your mind, in your everyday decisions, and in the way you respond when the world around you enters a crisis. From where do you choose to live? That question, which may sound philosophical, is actually the most practical and urgent question of all. And the conclusion of this video is one possible answer to it, an answer that comes from Padre Pio's own life and has the power to change everything. Padre Pio died on September 23, 1968, at the age of 81, more than 50 of those years with open wounds on his body. He spent decades being investigated, questioned, restricted, and at certain moments almost silenced by the very institutions that were supposed to protect him. And yet, during the final hours of his life, those who were present said that his face carried a peace that none of them knew how to describe in words, a peace that did not fit with a lifetime of suffering, a peace that had no human explanation. Someone asked him whether he was afraid to die, and he answered with something that remained engraved in the memory of everyone who heard it. He said, "Afraid of what? If the only task I had was to remember who I am and help others remember who they are, and I did that as far as I could, then there is nothing to fear." Stop there for a moment because that sentence summarizes everything. Not the prophecy, not the signs, not the mysteries of the universe, not the geopolitical convergences, and not the ancestral calendars. Everything, absolutely everything, comes down to this: remembering who you are and helping others remember who they are. In the world of 2026, doing that is a profoundly radical, almost subversive act, because we live within a system designed with frightening efficiency to make you forget, not necessarily in a conspiratorial or malicious way, but as the natural consequence of a world that rewards reaction over reflection, consumption over contemplation, and speed over depth. The algorithm does not show you what awakens you. It shows you what keeps you reactive, what makes you anxious enough to continue scrolling, what activates your fear, anger, or envy, because those emotions generate clicks, and clicks generate money. No one is going to interrupt you in the middle of that and ask, "Hey, but who are you really? Why are you here? What will you leave behind when you are gone?" You must ask yourself those questions alone. And that is exactly the most difficult and most important point in everything Padre Pio described for this time. He said that an age would come when the external noise would become so deafening that hearing the inner voice would require deliberate effort, conscious effort, an active choice to stop, to become silent, and to turn inward while the entire world turns outward. That age is now. And Mexico, with everything it is experiencing, is the most visible example of that tension, because it is a country surrounded by every imaginable form of external noise. A security crisis, geopolitical pressure, economic turbulence, and social fractures. Anyone could perfectly justify living in a permanent state of survival. And yet, within that same territory, something continues to emerge. Communities organize themselves without waiting for the government. Young people build alternative healthcare systems combining ancestral wisdom with modern knowledge. Collectives recover native seeds, endangered languages, ceremonial practices that seemed lost, and mutual support networks functioning with an efficiency no institution has been able to replicate. All of this coexists with the chaos, not despite the chaos, but within it. That is what Padre Pio called the resurrection of peoples. It is not a spectacular event that happens all at once and everyone sees. It is a silent, granular process, almost invisible to anyone who does not know what they are looking for. It is the seed growing beneath the earth before anyone can see it from above. But it is growing. And here comes the part that most directly concerns you, regardless of where you are watching this video. What is happening in Mexico is not separate from your life. It is a mirror of what is also happening in your country, your city, your community, and within you. The same tension between the force of forgetting and the force of remembrance that Padre Pio described for that land exists within every human being living in this time. Every day you wake up and, consciously or not, make that decision. Do I live from fear or from faith? Do I allow myself to be carried away by the noise? Or do I choose enough silence to hear myself? Do I react or respond? Do I consume or create? Do I isolate myself or connect? These are not abstract philosophical decisions. They are decisions you make while eating breakfast, while checking your phone, while speaking with your children, your parents, or your friends, while working, while driving, and while trying to sleep. Padre Pio did not predict the end of the world. He predicted the end of a way of living, one that operates through disconnection, automatic behavior, and forgetting who one is. And he predicted the beginning of another, one that requires greater courage because it has no shortcuts, one that requires honesty with yourself, one that requires you to be willing to ask uncomfortable questions and live with the answers, even when they are not the answers you expected. The sign that it has already begun is not only in Mexico. It is also in the fact that you are still here, watching this video until the end, searching for something beyond entertainment, searching for a connection with something deeper, searching for guidance in a world that moves too quickly and rarely stops to ask where it is going. That is not a coincidence. The universe does not send signs by accident, and people do not reach the end of a video about spiritual prophecies out of boredom. You arrived here because something within you recognizes that it is time. Time to awaken a little more. Time to remember who you are a little more clearly. Time to act from that place, even in a small way, even imperfectly, even without knowing exactly where it will take you. That is enough. Padre Pio said it. That is enough. The final thing I want to leave you with today is not an idea. It is a practice. Before this day ends, find 5 minutes of genuine silence. No phone, no music, no podcast, only you and the silence. And within that silence, ask yourself one question. What do I know I must do that I still have not done? Do not think too much. The first answer that comes is the true one. That is your next step. That is your contribution to the collective awakening Padre Pio saw from a monastery in southern Italy decades before you were born. He saw it. You are living it. And what you do with it is your decision. If this video moved something within you, Do not keep it only for yourself. Share it with someone who is also searching. Write in the comments what affected you the most. I read every message with genuine interest. And if you are not yet part of this community, subscribe now and activate the notification bell. Every week, we bring content that seeks exactly this, to help you remember who you are and why you are here. The awakening has already begun. The question is whether you are going to be part of it.